Daniel never planned to buy a mansion. He was just driving through Michigan one weekend, taking the scenic route back from visiting his parents. The kind of drive where you roll down the windows, put on some music, and just let the stress of city life melt away. He'd been working crazy hours at his tech company for the past 3 years, and honestly, he needed a break from staring at computer screens. That's when he saw it. Through a gap in the trees, there was this massive house sitting right on the lake. It looked like something out of an old movie. 3 stories tall with a big wraparound porch and these beautiful tower sections on each corner. But here's the thing that caught his attention. The whole place was completely covered in ivy and weeds. Paint was peeling off in huge chunks. Some windows were broken. It was clear nobody had lived there in a very long time. Daniel pulled over and just stared at it for a while. He'd always loved old houses. As a kid, he used to draw floor plans of Victorian mansions during boring classes. His mom used to joke that he should have been an architect instead of a programmer. There was something about this house, though. Even in its broken-down state, you could see how grand it must have been. The way it sat on that hill overlooking the water, the intricate woodwork around the windows, the sheer size of it. He took a few photos on his phone and was about to drive away when he noticed a faded for sale sign, half hidden in the overgrown bushes. Daniel wrote down the number. All the way home, he couldn't stop thinking about that house. What was its story? Who lived there? Why did they leave? The next day at work, he couldn't concentrate. During his lunch break, he called the number from the sign. A real estate agent named Betty answered. She sounded surprised anyone was calling about that property. She told him it had been sitting on the market for 8 months. The previous owner had died 15 years ago with no family to inherit it. The estate had been tied up in legal proceedings for years before finally being cleared to sell. Betty warned him right away. The house needed serious work. The county had inspected it and found structural issues. The roof leaked. The electrical system was ancient. The plumbing probably needed a complete overhaul. She rattled off problem after problem, probably trying to scare him away. But Daniel wasn't scared. He was excited. Then she told him the price. $85,000. Daniel actually laughed. He thought she was joking. This was a massive waterfront property. 5 acres of land. Direct lake access. In decent condition, a place like this would sell for millions. Even as a complete fixer-upper, it should have been worth at least $500,000. Something felt off. He asked Betty why it was so cheap. She got quiet for a second. Then she explained that the location was a bit complicated. The house sat on the edge of a fancy neighborhood called Clearwater Shores. It was technically within their boundaries, but just barely. The previous owner had some kind of dispute with them and never paid their homeowner association fees. Nobody really knew the full story. Most buyers had walked away because they didn't want to deal with potential HOA drama. Daniel thought about it for maybe 30 seconds before asking when he could see it. Betty agreed to meet him that Saturday. The week dragged by. Daniel couldn't stop looking at the photos he'd taken. He started researching Victorian architecture. He watched renovation videos on YouTube. His coworkers probably thought he'd lost his mind. He kept talking about crown molding and original hardwood floors. His best friend told him he was crazy for even considering buying a money pit like that. But here's the thing. Daniel had just sold a small startup company he'd been running on the side. Nothing huge, but enough that he had a decent chunk of money sitting in his bank account. He'd been thinking about what to do with it. Invest in stocks? Buy a regular condo? Save it all for retirement? None of those options excited him. But this house made him feel something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Saturday finally arrived. Daniel met Betty at the property. Up close, it was even more impressive and more damaged than he'd thought. They walked through every room. The main staircase was this gorgeous curved design with hand-carved banisters. Most of the original light fixtures were still there, covered in dust and cobwebs. There were built-in bookshelves in what used to be a library, a huge stone fireplace in the living room, original stained glass windows in several rooms, though some were cracked or missing pieces. Betty pointed out all the problems. Water damage on the ceilings, cracks in the foundation, outdated wiring that was probably a fire hazard, a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1960s. But Daniel saw past all of that. He saw what it could become. They walked out onto the back porch, and that's when Daniel knew he was going to buy it. The view was incredible. The lake stretched out in front of them, sparkling in the afternoon sun. Huge old trees framed the property. There was even a small boathouse down by the water, half collapsed but still standing. He could already imagine sitting out here with his morning coffee, watching the sunrise over the water. Daniel made an offer that same day. Full asking price. Betty seemed shocked. She asked if he wanted to think about it, maybe get an inspection first. He told her he'd get an inspection before closing, but he was serious. He wanted this house. The next 3 weeks were a blur of paperwork. Daniel hired an inspector who confirmed everything Betty had warned him about. The house needed a lot of work, probably $200,000 worth of renovations at minimum, maybe more if they found additional problems once they started opening up walls. Daniel didn't care. He had the money and he had the vision. His family thought he was insane. His dad kept asking why he didn't just buy a nice new condo in the city. His mom worried about him living in such a remote location. His sister sent him articles about people who'd bought fixer-uppers and ended up bankrupt. But Daniel had made up his mind. The closing day arrived. Daniel signed what felt like a million papers. When the realtor handed him the keys, he actually got a little emotional. He'd never owned property before, and now he owned a mansion. Sure, it was a broken-down mansion that might fall apart if he sneezed too hard, but it was his. He drove straight to the house after closing, parked in the circular driveway, walked up those creaky porch steps and unlocked the front door. The house was quiet, dusty, a little spooky, honestly, but it was home, or at least it would be. Daniel stood in the grand entryway and looked around. The afternoon light was coming through the dirty windows, creating patterns on the worn wooden floors. He pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. This was day one, the beginning of what would be an incredible transformation. He had no idea that in a few months he'd return to find his dream being literally torn down around him. But right then, standing in his new mansion, Daniel felt nothing but hope and excitement. This was going to be the adventure of a lifetime. Daniel spent the first month after closing just figuring out what he'd gotten himself into. He wasn't ready to move in yet. The house didn't have working heat, and half the plumbing was questionable at best. So he rented a room at a small hotel about 20 minutes away. Every morning he'd drive to the mansion with his laptop, a thermos of coffee, and a notebook. Those first few weeks were like being a detective. He'd walk through every room, taking measurements, making lists, taking hundreds of photos. The house was bigger than he'd realized. 22 rooms in total, not counting bathrooms and closets. Each one had its own character. The master bedroom had this amazing bay window overlooking the lake. There was a small room on the 3rd floor that must have been a nursery once with hand-painted clouds on the ceiling. The basement had a wine cellar with stone archways. Daniel hired an architect first. She walked through the house with him, pointing out what was structural and what was cosmetic. The good news was the foundation was solid despite a few cracks. The bad news was pretty much everything else needed attention. They spent 3 days going over every detail, and she started drawing up plans for the renovation. Next came the contractors. Daniel interviewed 5 different companies before finding one he trusted. The owner was this older guy named Frank who'd been renovating historic homes for 30 years. Frank didn't sugarcoat anything. He told Daniel straight up that this project would take at least a year and cost a fortune. But he also understood why Daniel wanted to save the house. Frank had that same look in his eyes when he examined the original crown molding and built-in cabinets. They put together a plan. First priority was the roof, then electrical, then plumbing. After that, they'd tackle the cosmetic stuff room by room. Daniel wanted to preserve as much of the original character as possible. That meant saving the hardwood floors, restoring the stained glass, keeping the vintage light fixtures. It would cost more to do it this way, but it would be worth it. Daniel also had to deal with permits. He spent a frustrating week at the county building department, filling out forms and waiting in lines. But eventually he got everything approved. The county inspector was actually pretty cool about it. He told Daniel he was glad someone was finally saving that old house. Apparently the locals had been watching it fall apart for years. Everything was moving forward. Daniel had set a start date 6 weeks out. That would give him time to clear out all the junk and debris from inside the house. There was a lot of it. Old furniture too damaged to save. Boxes of moldy papers. Random stuff the previous owner had left behind. Daniel spent his weekends hauling trash to the dump. It was during one of these cleanup weekends that the first letter arrived. Daniel had set up a forwarding address to his hotel, but some mail was still coming to the house. He found it stuck in the old mailbox at the end of the driveway. An official-looking envelope with Clearwater Shores Homeowners Association printed in the corner. Daniel opened it right there on the driveway. The letter was short and cold. It stated that his property was located within the Clearwater Shores community boundaries. According to their records, homeowner association dues had not been paid for over 15 years. They were demanding immediate payment of $47,000 in back dues, plus interest and late fees. Daniel read it twice, sure he must be misunderstanding something. $47,000 for what? He didn't even know what the HOA did. His property wasn't in their neighborhood. It was way off on the edge, surrounded by woods and water. He'd never even met anyone from Clearwater Shores. He called his real estate agent first. Betty sounded apologetic but not surprised. She reminded him that she'd mentioned the HOA situation. The previous owner had refused to acknowledge them or pay dues. They'd sent letters for years, but nothing ever came of it. Betty assumed the debt had died with the previous owner. She suggested Daniel talk to a lawyer just to be safe. So Daniel hired a real estate attorney. The guy looked over the letter, reviewed Daniel's deed, and studied the property boundaries. His advice was clear. Don't pay. The debt belonged to the previous owner's estate, not to Daniel. Plus, the attorney wasn't even sure the HOA had legitimate jurisdiction over Daniel's property. It sat on the very edge of their claimed territory, and there was no record of it ever being officially included in their covenant. Feeling confident, Daniel wrote a polite response to the HOA. He explained that he was the new owner, that he wasn't responsible for the previous owner's debts, and that his attorney had advised him the dues weren't valid anyway. He kept it professional and friendly. He even mentioned that he was renovating the property and improving the neighborhood. He mailed the letter and forgot about it. He had bigger things to worry about, like the fact that he'd found termite damage in the back porch, or that the inspector had discovered the main water line might need to be replaced, or that he'd fallen through a rotten floorboard in one of the upstairs bedrooms and nearly broken his ankle. 2 weeks passed. Daniel was at the house one afternoon, meeting with an electrician to discuss rewiring the second floor. His phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. It was a man who identified himself as Richard, president of the Clearwater Shores HOA. His voice was friendly, but there was an edge to it. He said he'd received Daniel's letter and wanted to discuss the situation. Richard explained that the HOA took great pride in maintaining the beauty and property values of Clearwater Shores. Daniel's property, while on the edge, was still technically within their boundaries. They couldn't just let 15 years of unpaid dues slide. Daniel tried to explain his position. He was new here. He didn't owe anyone anything. He was actually improving the property, which should make everyone happy. Richard listened quietly, then suggested they meet in person to discuss it. Maybe they could work something out. Something about the conversation made Daniel uneasy, but he agreed to meet. They set up a time for the following week at a coffee shop, halfway between the house and the main Clearwater Shores development. Daniel showed up on time. Richard was already there, dressed in an expensive suit even though it was a Saturday. He was probably in his late 50s with perfect silver hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. They shook hands and sat down. Richard started off friendly, asking about Daniel's renovation plans. He seemed genuinely interested in the details. Then he shifted gears. He pulled out a folder full of documents, copies of the HOA covenant, maps showing property boundaries, records of dues payments from other homes in the area. The conversation turned into a negotiation. Richard said the HOA board understood Daniel's position. Maybe they could reduce the back dues, say $20,000 instead of $47,000. In exchange, Daniel would agree to pay current dues going forward, about $500 a month. Daniel said he'd think about it, but honestly he had no intention of paying. His attorney had been clear. This was just the HOA trying to shake him down. He thanked Richard for his time and left. The next letter arrived 3 days later. This one wasn't friendly. It stated that Daniel was in violation of Clearwater Shores community standards. His property was an eyesore that negatively impacted surrounding property values. If he didn't begin paying dues immediately and bring the property into compliance, the HOA would be forced to take legal action. Daniel called his attorney, who told him not to worry. These were scare tactics. The HOA couldn't actually do anything. They had no legal standing to force payment or compliance. The worst they could do was sue and they'd lose, so Daniel ignored the letter. He had a renovation to focus on. Frank's crew was ready to start in 2 weeks. Daniel had already picked out new light fixtures and ordered custom millwork to match the original designs. He'd found a company that could restore the stained glass windows. Everything was coming together. Another letter arrived a week later, then another, each one more threatening than the last. They mentioned enforcement measures. They talked about protecting the community. They warned about properties being subject to HOA action. The language was vague but ominous. Daniel's attorney told him to keep the letters but not respond. Don't engage with them. Focus on his project. Everything was legal on Daniel's end. He had his permits. He owned the property free and clear. The HOA was just bluffing. The weekend before renovation was set to begin, Daniel drove to the house to meet with Frank one last time before the crew started work. It was a beautiful Tuesday morning. The sun was sparkling on the lake. The trees were full and green. Daniel felt a surge of excitement as he turned down his driveway. In exactly 2 days, the real work would begin. His dream of restoring this beautiful old house was finally becoming reality. He had the plans, the permits, the money, and the team. Nothing could stop him now, or so he thought. Because what Daniel didn't know was that Richard and the HOA board had already set their own plan in motion, and by the time he discovered what they'd done, it would be too late to stop them. Daniel woke up that Tuesday morning feeling excited. Today was the day he'd been waiting for. Frank and his crew were meeting him at the mansion at 9 to finalize the game plan before starting work tomorrow. Daniel grabbed his coffee, threw on some jeans and an old t-shirt, and headed out. The drive to the property usually took about 25 minutes, and he spent most of it mentally going through his checklist. He turned onto the long driveway that led to his house. The trees on either side created a tunnel of green, and normally this approach gave him such a peaceful feeling. But something was wrong. He could hear machinery. Heavy machinery. The kind of deep rumbling that meant serious equipment. Daniel's heart started pounding. He pressed harder on the gas pedal, his car bouncing over the uneven driveway. As he came around the final curve, his stomach dropped. There was a massive yellow excavator sitting in his front yard. An actual excavator with its huge metal arm extended toward his house. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that a huge section of the mansion's east wing was just gone. Completely demolished. Where there used to be walls and windows and rooms, there was now just a pile of broken wood, shattered glass, and crushed brick. Dust hung in the air. A dump truck was parked nearby, already half filled with debris. Daniel slammed on his brakes and jumped out of his car before it had fully stopped. He was running toward the excavator, screaming at the top of his lungs. "Stop, what are you doing?" "Stop right now." The excavator operator saw him and powered down the machine. Several workers in hard hats and safety vests turned to look at him. Daniel must have looked insane, red-faced and yelling, but he didn't care. These people were tearing down his house. A man with a clipboard walked over. He was the foreman, probably in his 40s, looking confused and a little annoyed. "Sir, you need to calm down. This is a demolition site. It's not safe for you to be here. This is my house," Daniel shouted. His voice cracked. He could feel tears starting to form, but he fought them back. "This is my property." "What are you doing?" The foreman's expression changed from annoyed to uncertain. "This is your property?" "We were told this was an abandoned building. We have orders to demolish it." "Orders from who?" Daniel demanded. His hands were shaking. Behind the foreman, he could see his beautiful sunroom reduced to rubble. The library where he'd found all those built-in bookshelves was just gone. Completely erased. The foreman flipped through papers on his clipboard. "The Clearwater Shores Homeowners Association. We got the work order last week. Mr. Richard Sutherland authorized it personally. Said it was an unsafe structure that needed to come down." Daniel felt like he might throw up. Richard. The HOA president he'd met at the coffee shop. The one who'd been sending threatening letters. "Let me see that paperwork," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady. The foreman handed over the work order. It looked official, with the HOA letterhead and Richard's signature. But there was no county permit number. No official authorization. Daniel pulled out his phone with shaking hands and called 911. "I need the police," he said when the dispatcher answered. Someone is illegally demolishing my house right now. I'm the owner and I never authorized this. While they waited for the police, Daniel called his attorney. He was pacing back and forth, trying not to look at the destruction. Every time he glanced at the pile of rubble, he felt sick. The attorney told him to stay calm, document everything, and wait for the police. The workers had all stopped. They were standing around looking uncomfortable. A couple of them were on their phones, probably calling their boss. The foreman kept apologizing, saying they were just doing the job they were hired to do. They'd been told everything was legal and approved. 2 sheriff's deputies arrived about 15 minutes later. Daniel had never been so relieved to see police in his life. He ran over to them, trying to explain the situation as clearly as possible despite the panic he felt. He showed them his deed proving he owned the property. He showed them the work order the demolition crew had. He pulled up the threatening letters from the HOA on his phone. The deputies took everything seriously. They talked to the foreman, examined the paperwork, made some calls. One deputy went to his car and spent about 10 minutes on the radio. When he came back, his expression was grim. "There's no county demolition permit on file for this address," the deputy said. "This work is not authorized." The foreman's face went pale. "But we were told everything was approved. Mr. Sutherland said he had all the necessary permits." "Well, he doesn't," the deputy said firmly. "This work needs to stop immediately. We're treating this as a property destruction case." The deputy ordered the demolition crew to pack up their equipment and leave. He told them not to touch anything else. Then he started taking statements from everyone. Daniel stood there watching the workers load up their tools, feeling numb. It was over, but the damage was already done. After the crew left, Daniel finally let himself really look at what had been destroyed. The entire east wing of his mansion was gone. That section had included the beautiful sunroom with its original stained glass windows, the library with hand-carved built-in shelves, a bathroom with vintage tile, a small bedroom on the second floor. All of it was now just a pile of broken materials. He walked closer to the rubble. Among the broken wood and bricks, he could see pieces of stained glass, shattered but still colorful. He picked up a chunk of carved wood that had been part of the library shelving. It was intricate work, probably done by hand over 100 years ago. Irreplaceable. And now destroyed. The deputies took photos of everything. They asked Daniel more questions. Had he had any disputes with the HOA? Had there been any threats? Daniel told them everything. The letters demanding money, the meeting with Richard, the escalating threats. The deputies exchanged glances. "This looks like it might be intentional," one deputy said carefully. "Like someone was trying to force you to abandon the property or sell it." That thought hadn't even occurred to Daniel yet. He'd been too shocked to think that far ahead. But it made a terrible kind of sense. The HOA had been trying to get him to pay or leave. When he refused, they took drastic action. The deputies said they'd file a report and investigate. They suggested Daniel get a lawyer involved immediately, which he'd obviously already planned to do. They also recommended he install security cameras and maybe even hire someone to watch the property until this was resolved. After the police left, Daniel just stood there. He called Frank and told him not to come. There was no point in meeting about renovation plans now. He'd need to deal with this disaster first. Frank was shocked and angry on Daniel's behalf. He promised to help however he could. Daniel spent the rest of the day at the property just trying to process what had happened. He took hundreds of photos from every angle. He made a list of everything that had been destroyed. He called his insurance company, though he wasn't sure if they'd cover this kind of intentional damage. As the sun started to set, Daniel sat on the front porch steps, the same steps he'd climbed so happily on closing day just a few weeks ago. He looked out at his property. The beautiful lake view was still there. Most of the house was still standing. But that gaping hole where the east wing used to be felt like an open wound. He'd spent months planning this renovation. He'd imagined every detail. He'd been so excited to bring this old house back to life. And in one morning, people he'd never met had destroyed part of his dream. They'd literally torn it down with heavy machinery. Daniel felt angry, hurt, confused, and overwhelmed all at once. But underneath all those emotions, something else was building. Determination. These people thought they could bully him into giving up. They thought they could just take what was his. Well, they were wrong. He pulled out his phone and called his attorney again. This time he wasn't calling for advice. He was calling to start a lawsuit. If the Clearwater Shores HOA wanted a fight, they were about to get one. Daniel wasn't going anywhere. He was going to fix his house, and he was going to make sure the people who did this paid for what they'd done. The mansion might be wounded, but it wasn't beaten, and neither was Daniel. Daniel's attorney didn't waste any time. By the end of that same week, they'd filed a lawsuit against the Clearwater Shores Homeowners Association, Richard Sutherland personally, and the demolition company. The charges included property destruction, trespassing, fraud, and a bunch of other legal terms Daniel didn't fully understand but was happy to pursue. The first step was getting a temporary restraining order to prevent any further damage to the property. The judge granted it immediately after reviewing the police report and photos of the destruction. The HOA was legally prohibited from coming anywhere near Daniel's property or contacting him directly. Daniel also hired a security company to install cameras all around the mansion. Not just a couple cameras either. They put up 12 high-definition cameras covering every angle. Motion sensors. The whole system. If anyone so much as stepped onto his property, he'd know about it. He also had Frank's crew come out and put up temporary walls to protect the exposed areas where the demolition had happened. Heavy tarps, plywood, anything to keep the weather out. The legal discovery process started a few weeks later. That's when Daniel's attorney got to demand documents from the HOA. Board meeting minutes, financial records, communications, everything. And what they found was shocking. Turns out the Clearwater Shores HOA had been trying to buy Daniel's property for almost 3 years. They wanted to build a fancy marina and yacht club for the neighborhood. Daniel's waterfront land was perfect for it. They'd made multiple offers to the previous owner before he died. Low offers, too, way below market value. The old owner had refused every time and told them to leave him alone. When the property went to estate sale, the HOA board had voted to try buying it. But Daniel's offer had come in first and been accepted before they could act. According to the meeting minutes, Richard had been furious. He'd argued that they should contest the sale somehow. The rest of the board had disagreed, saying there was no legal grounds to do that. But Richard hadn't given up. The documents showed he'd personally been pushing the demolition idea for weeks. He told the board that if they declared the property abandoned and unsafe, they could legally demolish it under their enforcement powers. Most of the board members had been skeptical. A couple had argued strongly against it, but Richard had pushed through anyway. Here's where it got really interesting. Richard owned a construction company, not the demolition company he'd hired, but a development firm that would have been contracted to build the marina. He stood to make hundreds of thousands of dollars personally if the project went through. He'd never disclosed this conflict of interest to the other board members. Daniel's attorney was practically gleeful when he found all this. This guy basically committed fraud while in a position of trust, he explained to Daniel over coffee one afternoon. He used his authority as HOA president to damage your property for his own financial gain. This is huge. The HOA's defense was weak from the start. They tried to argue that they genuinely believed the property was abandoned and posed a safety hazard to the community, but the evidence didn't support that. Daniel had been actively working on the property. He'd pulled county permits. He'd been in communication with the HOA through their letters. There was no way they could claim they thought it was abandoned. They also tried to argue that their HOA covenant gave them authority to address properties that violated community standards. Daniel's attorney shot that down quickly. Even if that were true, which was debatable, they'd need to follow proper legal procedures. You can't just hire a demolition crew to tear down someone's house without court orders and county permits. The whole thing started attracting media attention. A local news station did a story about it. Then a newspaper picked it up. Pretty soon, Daniel was getting interview requests from regional news outlets. The story had everything people loved. An underdog. Fighting against corrupt authority. Historic property destruction. A David versus Goliath situation. Daniel agreed to do a few interviews. He figured public pressure might help. The coverage was almost entirely sympathetic to him. They showed before pictures of the mansion's beautiful east wing, then after pictures of the rubble pile. They interviewed neighbors who were shocked that the HOA would do something so extreme. One interview showed Richard refusing to comment and hurrying away from a reporter, which didn't make him look great. The publicity had an interesting effect. Other people started coming forward with their own HOA horror stories. Clearwater Shores apparently had a reputation for being aggressive with homeowners. Tons of fines for minor violations. Lawsuits over trivial matters. Several former residents contacted Daniel's attorney saying they'd left the neighborhood specifically because of HOA harassment. Meanwhile, Daniel was living in limbo. He couldn't move into the house. He couldn't even start proper renovations until the lawsuit was resolved. The property just sat there with its gaping wound covered in tarps. Every day he drove by and saw it made him angry all over again. The worst part was the uncertainty. His attorney was confident they'd win, but lawsuits take time. Months, maybe over a year. What was Daniel supposed to do in the meantime? Keep paying for a hotel? The house was deteriorating more every day it sat exposed to the elements. About 4 months into the legal process, something unexpected happened. The HOA's insurance company got involved. They'd been covering the HOA's legal defense, but as the evidence piled up, they realized how bad this looked. Their own lawyers reviewed everything and apparently freaked out. Insurance companies don't like clear-cut liability cases. They cost money to defend and even more money when you lose. The insurance company's representatives contacted Daniel's attorney about settlement discussions. The initial offer was insulting. They offered to pay for repairs to the damaged section, maybe $50,000. Daniel's attorney laughed and sent back a counteroffer, $1.5 million. That would cover full restoration of the damaged areas using proper historic preservation methods, all of Daniel's legal fees, compensation for the irreplaceable historic materials that were destroyed, pain and suffering, and punitive damages. The insurance company said no way, too high. They countered with $200,000. Daniel's attorney said they'd see them in court. Several weeks passed with no movement. Then things shifted. The HOA board, separate from Richard, started making noise. They'd hired their own attorney. Turns out they were considering suing Richard personally for exceeding his authority and exposing them to liability. Some board members claimed they'd never actually approved the demolition. The meeting minutes were ambiguous enough that there was dispute about what had been decided. The HOA was fracturing. Board members were resigning. Homeowners in Clearwater Shores were furious that their dues were going to pay for this legal mess. There was talk of a special election to remove Richard from the board entirely. It was chaos. Daniel's attorney used this to their advantage. He filed additional motions. He requested Richard's personal financial records. He deposed board members who all said slightly different things about what they'd known and approved. The case against Richard personally was getting stronger and stronger. The insurance company came back with a better offer, $400,000. Daniel's attorney said no. They countered at $1.3 million. Back and forth it went. Meanwhile, Daniel had to watch as the 2-month marker passed, then 4 months, then 6. His beautiful mansion was weathering badly. Some of the temporary tarps had blown off in storms. Water was getting into areas that had been protected before. The damage was spreading. He tried to stay patient. His attorney kept telling him they were winning. The evidence was overwhelmingly in their favor. But Daniel was exhausted. The stress was affecting his health. He wasn't sleeping well. He'd lost weight. His friends worried about him. 8 months after the demolition, things finally started moving toward resolution. The trial date was set for 2 weeks out. Daniel's attorney had prepared a detailed case with expert witnesses lined up. Architects who could testify about the historic value of what was destroyed. Contractors who could explain the cost of proper restoration. Even the county inspector who'd originally approved Daniel's permits was ready to testify that the demolition was completely unauthorized. The insurance company's lawyers looked at all this and apparently decided they didn't want to go to trial. The HOA's fractured leadership wasn't helping their case. Richard's personal financial interests were damning. The public opinion was entirely against them. They'd lose in court, and it would probably cost them even more than settling. 9 days before trial, Daniel got the call. The insurance company was offering $1.2 million. Full settlement. In exchange, Daniel would drop all claims. Richard would be removed as HOA president. And most importantly for Daniel, there would be a permanent legal declaration that his property was outside HOA jurisdiction. No dues, no covenant restrictions, no nothing. Complete independence. Daniel's attorney thought they could maybe get a bit more if they went to trial. But there was always risk with juries, and honestly, Daniel was tired. He wanted this to be over. He wanted to fix his house and move on with his life. He accepted the settlement. The settlement check cleared on a Thursday afternoon. Daniel stared at his bank account balance for a solid 5 minutes, still not quite believing it was real. $1.2 million. After legal fees and taxes, he'd have roughly $900,000 left. Combined with his own savings, he had more than enough to not just fix the mansion, but restore it properly, the way it deserved. He called Frank that same evening. "We're back on," Daniel said. "And this time we're doing it right. No cutting corners, no budget restrictions. I want to bring this house back exactly how it used to be." Frank was quiet for a moment. Then Daniel heard him exhale loudly. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've been thinking about this project for 8 months. I've got ideas." They met at the mansion the next morning. The place looked rough after sitting exposed to weather for so long. The temporary coverings had helped, but there was new water damage. Some areas that had been fine before were now problems. But Daniel didn't care. They were finally moving forward. Frank brought his whole team. Not just construction guys, but specialists. A historic preservation expert who'd worked on Victorian homes across the country. An architect who specialized in period-accurate restoration. A craftsman who could recreate the hand-carved woodwork. They walked through every inch of the property, taking notes, making plans. The destroyed East Wing was obviously the first priority. But they couldn't just rebuild it. They needed to recreate it exactly as it had been. That meant research. Lots of research. Daniel spent weeks tracking down historical records. He found old photographs of the mansion from the early 1900s at the County Historical Society. He discovered property tax records that included descriptions of the rooms. He even found the original architectural plans in the state archives. They were fragile, yellowed paper, but they showed every detail of how the house had been built. The sunroom had been the crown jewel of that wing. It had featured custom stained glass windows with a nature pattern, lots of birds and flowers. Those windows were destroyed, but Daniel found a photo showing them clearly. He took it to a stained glass artist 3 hours away. She studied the photo for a long time, then smiled. "I can recreate these," she said. "It'll take me 4 months, but I can do it." The library's built-in bookshelves had been hand-carved mahogany with intricate details. Daniel hired a master woodworker who specialized in Victorian-era carpentry. The guy looked at the few pieces Daniel had saved from the rubble pile. He examined the carved details under a magnifying glass. "This is beautiful work," he said quietly. "Whoever made these was a true craftsman. I'd be honored to recreate them." While all this specialized work was being arranged, Frank's crew started on the structural repairs. They had to rebuild the foundation where the East Wing had been demolished. They replaced the roof over the entire house, not just the damaged section. They rewired the whole electrical system. They updated all the plumbing with new pipes while carefully preserving the vintage fixtures. It was slow work, but Daniel didn't mind anymore. He'd learned patience through the legal battle. Now he was learning appreciation. Every day he'd visit the site and see progress. Not dramatic changes, but steady improvement. The house was healing. Daniel decided to live on site during the renovation. Frank helped him set up a small apartment in what used to be the carriage house. It was rough living, heated by space heaters and with a makeshift kitchen. But Daniel wanted to be there. He wanted to be part of the process. He started documenting everything, taking photos every single day, making videos explaining what was being done and why. He posted them online and people loved following along. His channel grew. People from around the world commented, sharing their own historic home stories, offering encouragement. It became this unexpected community. The stained glass artist finished the sunroom windows after 5 months, not 4. But when Daniel saw them, he nearly cried. They were perfect. The colors caught the light exactly like in the old photographs. She'd matched every detail, every curve of glass. When they installed them, the sunroom came alive. Colored light spilled across the floor, creating patterns that danced as the sun moved. The woodworker finished the library bookshelves around the same time. Mahogany, hand-carved, with the same intricate details as the originals. Even the smell was right, that rich wood scent. When they installed them, Daniel ran his hand over the carved details. They felt like they'd always been there. Piece by piece, room by room, the mansion came back to life. The master bedroom was restored with period-appropriate wallpaper, and careful refinishing of the original hardwood floors. The kitchen was updated with modern appliances but designed to look vintage. They found an old farmhouse sink at a salvage yard that was perfect. The bathrooms got new plumbing but kept their original tile and fixtures. The third-floor nursery with the hand-painted clouds. They found old photos showing it had been painted by the original owner's daughter back in 1923. Daniel hired an artist to carefully restore the clouds, touching up faded areas while preserving as much of the original work as possible. One of the biggest surprises came when they were working on the basement. Behind a false wall, they found a hidden room. It was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet with stone walls. Nobody knew what it had been used for originally. Maybe storage, maybe a root cellar. Daniel decided to turn it into a wine cellar. They installed temperature control, proper racks, and soft lighting. It became one of his favorite spaces in the house. Frank suggested some modern additions that wouldn't hurt the historic character. A small home theater in what had been a storage room, a gym in part of the basement, updated insulation throughout to make the place energy efficient. Daniel agreed to all of it. The house should be comfortable, not just beautiful. 18 months after they'd started the restoration work, it was finished. Well, mostly finished. Houses like this are never truly done. There's always something to maintain, improve, or adjust. But it was livable. It was beautiful. It was home. Daniel moved his furniture in gradually. He didn't have much, so he spent months finding the right pieces. Antique furniture that matched the house's period. Modern comfort items disguised to look vintage. Every room came together slowly, deliberately. He decided to host an open house once everything was settled. He invited everyone who'd been part of the journey. Frank and his entire crew. The stained glass artist, the woodworker, the architect, the historic preservation expert, his attorney, even some of the journalists who'd covered his story. He also invited his neighbors and members of the local community. Many of them had watched the saga unfold. They'd seen the mansion sitting abandoned, then purchased, then partially destroyed, then slowly restored. They were curious to see the final result. The day of the open house was perfect. Sunny, warm, with a light breeze coming off the lake. Daniel stood on the front porch greeting people as they arrived. Everyone's reaction was the same. They'd step through the front door into the grand entryway and just stop. Mouths open, looking around at the restored woodwork, the vintage light fixtures, the gleaming floors. "This is incredible," people kept saying. "You did an amazing job." But the best reactions came when people saw the east wing, the section that had been demolished. The sunroom with its stained glass windows glowing in the afternoon sun. The library with its perfect recreated bookshelves. You couldn't tell it had ever been destroyed. It looked like it had been there for 100 years. Frank pulled Daniel aside at one point during the party. "You know, I've worked on a lot of houses in my career," he said. "But this one's special, not just because of the work, but because of what it represents. You could have walked away, sold the property, cut your losses, but you fought for it, and look what we created." Daniel looked around at his home full of people. Laughter echoed through the rooms. Sunlight streamed through old windows. The house felt alive in a way it probably hadn't for decades. "It was worth every minute of the fight," he said. As the evening wound down and guests started leaving, Daniel walked through the empty rooms. He ended up in the sunroom, watching the sun set over the lake through the stained glass windows. The colored light painted everything in warm tones of red and gold. He thought about everything that had happened. Finding the mansion on that random weekend drive, the excitement of buying it, the planning and preparation, the shock of the demolition, the long, exhausting legal battle, and finally the restoration. 2 years of his life had gone into this journey. Some people thought he was crazy for fighting so hard. His dad still occasionally mentioned that a nice new condo would have been easier. But standing there in his restored mansion, Daniel knew he'd made the right choice. This house had history, character, soul. It deserved to be saved, and honestly, saving it had changed him too. He'd learned that some things are worth fighting for, that patience and determination pay off, that communities form around shared struggles, that beauty and craftsmanship matter. Daniel pulled out his phone and took a picture of the sunset through the stained glass. He posted it online with a simple caption, "Home." The responses came flooding in immediately. Congratulations from the followers who'd been with him through the whole journey. Heart emojis and encouraging words. People thanking him for saving the historic property, others asking for advice on their own renovation projects. As the last light faded from the sky, Daniel locked up and headed to bed. His bed in his room in his mansion. Tomorrow he'd probably find some new project to work on, maybe restore the old boathouse down by the water, or clear some of the overgrown gardens. There was always something to do, but tonight he was just going to sleep peacefully in his dream home. The home that almost wasn't. The home he'd fought an entire HOA to save. The home that proved sometimes the best things in life are worth fighting for, no matter what obstacles get thrown in your way. The mansion stood strong on its hill overlooking the lake, lights glowing warmly from within. After years of abandonment and neglect, after being partially destroyed, after months of careful restoration, it was finally what it was always meant to be. It was home.